Hi, Tammy Silvers of Tamarini's. Welcome to video 2 in the Paper Piecing Basics series. Now, you may have paper pieced a unit, and then sometimes oftentimes with many of your paper piecing patterns, you're going to need to join units. So let's talk about that. Now, first of all, sometimes when you're piecing your unit, you've got fabric that's hanging over the edge, outside the edge of your pattern. So before we start joining units, one thing that we want to do is make sure that we trim. Now, with most of your paper piecing patterns, you're going to have a lighter or dashed line on the outside edge, which is going to be that outside seam allowance. So simply using a ruler and my rotary cutter, I can trim away that excess. I can trim away on that dashed line, and when I do, I am now trimming that paper piecing pattern down to size. And it's worth taking that little bit of extra time to get that unit down to the right size. And you can see that the unit I'm working with is an odd shape. And that happens a lot. Usually that's why you're paper piecing a pattern, is because it has odd shapes, odd angles, difficult points that might be really, really hard to achieve with regular templates or with regular strip piecing or just general piecing. All right, so I've trimmed my entire unit along the dash line. Now, there's my unit. You can see how pretty it looks. I want to join it to this unit. Now, if you watched video 1, you'll remember that I mentioned using a basting stitch. I've already done this on this corner unit, and I've done it because these are big pieces and they would flop around. So I've already basted those corners down so that they're going to stay in place. And that way, when I go to trim, everything is going to stay in place. My fabric's not going to flip on me. I'm not going to accidentally trim away more than I wanted to because the fabric flipped up underneath it. This keeps everything nice and in place. Okay, so according to my pattern, oh wait, this is my pattern. This is from my perpetual pattern. I want to join these two pieces. Now you're going to notice that when I go to join these two pieces, this corner unit is actually longer than this unit. So yes, I have a straight edge and I can join those two straight edges, but where up and down the edge do I place them? So here's a tip. When you're joining units, here's how I approach it. I like to use some nice sharp pins, and I put a pin through one intersection. So using my sewing lines, my solid lines, I put a pin on that intersection, and then I'm going to turn the pattern over, the piece I'm sewing it to, and I'm putting a pin at that intersection as well. So now I've matched up that corner. So I want to do the same thing on the opposite corner. I want to put a pin at this intersection, and then I want to turn it over, and I want to put a pin at that intersection. Okay, so now I have my two corners. But if you're looking at this, you may be thinking, well, I can't put that in the sewing machine. Those pins are sticking out. You're absolutely right. You can't. So now that I've got my two corners in position, I'm going to take another pin, and I'm going to pin. And what I want to make sure is that my pin is going through my sewing line on the front as well as on the back. And once I've done that, now I can remove these pins. Now, if I need to, I can go in and I can pin along additional places on that sewing line. So for bigger units, I could definitely do that. But then I'm going to go over to my sewing machine, and with a shortened stitch length, so we're still using that shortened stitch length, I'm going to sew out here. I'm going to start out in my seam allowance, and I'm going to sew all along that solid line, my sewing line, and completely off. Now, once I have done that, then it looks like this. At this point, here's what I recommend. I recommend removing the paper in the seam allowance. And I do that so you can see I'm just folding along that sewn line. And because you used a reduced stitch length, it's perforated the paper, and then by folding it back and forth, you've also weakened it along the paper, along that seam allowance. You haven't weakened your seam allowance. But remember how I mentioned in the first video, we want to use a reduced stitch length so that when we take that paper out, we don't tear our stitches out. So I've removed the paper on that side. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to remove the paper on this side. Okay. Now, what I recommend at this point, unless your instructions tell you differently, I recommend, as you can see, as I've done right here, pressing that seam open. It's going to give you a nice flat join. So when I flip this over, you can see how nice and flat that looks. So at this point, when I join units, each time I join a unit, because this is going to have some other things, I'm going to have other blocks that are going to be sewn to it. But each time I join a unit, I remove the paper, and then I'm going to press. Now, I'm using my finger right now just to show you, but I'm going to press this with an iron. Now, the other question I get is, okay, when do I remove the rest of the paper? I do not remove paper from a paper piecing unit until I have stitched it into the quilt. So for this one, I know that there are 3 other units that make up a block. And once I have sewn those 3 units, if I wanted to take out some of the interior paper, I could. But I typically leave my paper in until the entire quilt is sewn together. And this is because when you're working with these odd angles and all of these exposed bias edges, I want to keep everything nice and secure. It does get a little awkward. The quilt does get a little bit stiff, but it keeps everything in shape. But let's pretend for just a minute that this is a quilt in and of itself, and it is finished, and I'm ready to remove the paper. You saw how I folded the paper here along the seam allowance. You're going to do the same thing to start removing the paper. You're going to, and you can see the seam allowance is already removed, so this comes out pretty easily. And then I can fold this and I can just remove it. And you do it step by step. Now, if you run into some problems, you run into a difficult area, the paper just doesn't want to let go, you can take one of your pins and rub the sharp edge along that seam, along that stitch line, and that's going to further score the paper and make the paper easier to remove. So I hope this has helped getting you started on paper piecing, which is going to really expand the patterns that you're able to do and the shapes that you're able to do. I appreciate you spending time with me. Until next time, happy stitching.